the arts are confronting. And that's why I think conservative governments, with a small c, fear artists. Because we ask questions and we push boundaries, and I think that's absolutely necessary.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Juliet Gilkes Romero, a stage and screenwriter, and my guest today is Pat Cumper. Pat was born in Jamaica and has worked in the arts as a playwright, broadcaster and artistic director. Her work has been produced in the US, UK and Canada. Pat was the artistic director and CEO of Talawa, the UK's largest and oldest black-led theatre company. She was made an MBE in 2013 and is currently producing Faith, Hope and Glory for BBC Radio 4. Pat and I will be chatting about her life and we'll be taking a deep dive into the Royal Literary Fund archive featuring a huge range of fellow creatives discussing in depth what it means to be a writer. Welcome, Pat.
Well, it's lovely to be here.
I first encountered you as the artistic director of Talawa Theatre Company, and I think it was when you were overseeing the 25th anniversary season. But how did that happen? How was that journey for you? Did you ever imagine when you were in Jamaica that you would end up as the artistic director of a theatre company like Talawa?
Well, you see, what you have to do is realise that the Caribbean is everywhere. And Yvonne Brewster, who was one of the founders of Talawa Theatre Company, is also somebody that I knew from Jamaica. I knew of her more than knew her, I have to say, because she was sort of a generation older than me. So I knew of Talawa from Talawa, Timber, a couple of other theatre companies. And I was told when I was coming here, those were the ones to be in touch with. But because I knew Yvonne, I'd worked for Talawa in all sorts of other capacities before I was artistic director. I taught stuff. They produced a play of mine. So I'd been around the company for a long time and I began to understand its importance. And I also knew at the point that I applied that there was a strong movement to get rid of it or not to fund it. So at that point, I turned into my mother, who was a very firm lady, and decided, no, this wasn't going to happen. So I applied for the job, got it, and then sort of the struggle began.
That was quite a brave thing to do, to take on a theatre company that you knew was struggling.
I suppose so, but the longer you're here, living in England, because I'd spent quite a lot of time in Jamaica, the more you become aware of what it means to be part of a minoritized community and what it means, I think, for the full range of the voices from that community to be heard. Because there was a kind of standard black narrative. There was an awful lot of black American work being done. There was a kind of, there's an awful being black kind of narratives being done. And certainly from my background. And that was absolutely not the stuff that I thought we ought to be talking about, particularly if you're coming from, as I say, a minoritized community, that what you need to be is confident in the stories that you're telling. So there was a kind of small p political impulse behind it that I thought it was necessary to open up that space and to hold it. There's a little monkey on my shoulder, which is I've had such a lucky life in some ways. I've been to Cambridge, I've done quite a lot of things, that if I have a place that I can hold open so that other creatives can come through, then maybe that's something that I can do. I come from an interesting family. My mum was a lawyer. My dad was an economist. She sat on forever boards and they were always doing something and building something. So I think that sense of taking on an organization in order to create a space. Yeah, I was in my 40s, late 40s. So I got to the point where I thought, okay, my shoulders are broad enough. I'll try and take this one on. But yeah, I had no idea how long it would last or what it would do.
That speaks to a certain amount of resilience and a resilience when you were growing up. What was teenage Pat like in Jamaica?
I always think about it in terms of the context, because that would have been the late 60s and early 70s. And that was a hugely roiling political time. It was a time of the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. It was the socialist movement, Cuba, all of that sort of stuff was happening. We learned about the global south. We learned about things that were happening in Africa, in South Africa, all of these kinds of things, as well as what was happening. So yeah, we were very political as a bunch. We had a sixth form association, and as soon as the then Prime Minister, Michael Manley, won, he called all the sixth form associations together, because these were the kids of essentially middle-class families, but from all over the island, got us all together and said, look, we need to build a nation now.
That's amazing.
And if he had said to us at that point, because he was gorgeous and all of us were girls, if he had said to us at that point, take up a machete and go and cut cane, we would have done it. Because there was a sense of hope and a sense of being able to change things. We'd gone from being a place where you sent down barrels of cornflakes and soap powders and stuff from America in order to survive, to trying to be self-reliant. I mean, America didn't take kindly. So, there was a lot of, shall we say, resistance to the movement. But in fact, it was a sort of shaping moment for me. But also as a teenager, remember, I was a competitive swimmer. So I spent 5-6 days a week in the water. And that was another education. You learn about slow progress. You learn about winning and losing. You learn about loyalty, I think. So between an awful lot of swimming, I gave that up in sixth form, but basically an awful lot of swimming and sort of this kind of very lively political moment. And I think you also have to recognize in the Caribbean that women's status is different. I'm not saying that it's wonderful, but women are starters of businesses. They support families. They tend to be the cornerstone of social institutions. They run the churches, So to come from that background, it didn't feel unusual to take on something, So I think all of that played into it. And yeah, we had fun as well. We did all sorts of crazy things. But I think those are the kind of shaping forces of my sort of teenage years.
That's wonderful to hear because, unless we talk about these things, we don't always understand where people have come from and what shapes their journey. Let's go to some archive now and hear from Michael Macmillan, a playwright and artist, talking about how he discovered his cultural North Star, if you will.
I began painting at school, secondary school. Both my parents, as you mentioned, came from St. Vincent. We came to Hackney, early 1970s. My dad had a job at Ford's Dagenham, and we settled in Clapton. Eventually, we were in a house that we were evicted from, along with 5 other families, and we had a council flat in Hoxton. And I went to the Catchment Secondary School, which was Dainford Boys' School. Dainford Boys' School was famous for producing the Cray Twins and boxers like Michael Watson and also Isaac Julian.
A great pedigree of fighters.
Exactly. So on the street, telling people you came from Dainford kind of, had a certain kind of cachet, basically. But it also was a weird amalgam of people. It had communists, Maoists, Trotskyite teachers who were coming in to start the revolution in the Sink School, as it was called, in the East End. And you also had National Front, card-carrying members of the National Front as teachers. Brick Lane was nearby. Bangladeshi boys were let out early so they couldn't get stabbed. The Black and Asian boys were like 15%. There's a black boy at the school. You either fought or you just kept quiet. I occupied a space in between. I was quite big for my age at joining the school, so nobody really troubled me. And also, the school was in Bethnal Green. I lived in Hackney. Every evening, I would just get the 253 106 bus and disappear back to Hackney, which felt like a safe haven because it was more black. So within that kind of that context, basically, my creativity was kind of encouraged by a number of teachers, and I got into kind of painting, and I was given free rein for that. At that time, also as a teenager, I had some great teachers. One of them taught English, and he had a cupboard full of black literature and books, and he gave me access to them. So I started reading George Jackson and Malcolm X and James Baldwin. And he showed me an essay competition in the West Indian World. He said, go for it. Okay, I went for it, and I wrote an essay, and I won the competition. And at 15, the prize was to go to FESTAC, the Second World Festival of Black Arts and Culture in Nigeria. So at 15, I went on a plane, had my first passport, and went to Africa for the first time. And that changed me. I was just a changed person. Some of the people I met as Black arts practitioners there, I still have as friends, I still know them. But it opened another world. Remember, this is a working class boy growing up in Hackney, open to another kind of world that existed that people wouldn't know about. The following year, coming back, I wrote my first play. We were studying Sheila Delaney's A Taste of Honey at school. I was inspired by it. I wrote my play The School Leaver, about two young black boys growing up in school and their divergent kind of lives when they after school. I sent it into the Royal Court Young Writers Festival, and it was selected and it was done. And this was in 1978. It was then published by Black Ink Collective in Brixton. And that began my practice as a writer.
Is there anything about Michael's experience that strikes a chord with you?
One particular thing I have to say is the way he kind of drifted into doing various art forms, because he just thought he could. I was a little bit like that. Again, background, my family went to every theatre performance there was, from touring companies, from local, but we always went. So theatre was something that I quite enjoyed. And I went to a review put on by a producer called Ed Wallace. And I was standing by the bar afterwards and being very snippy about what was on the stage. And he was standing behind me. And he said, well, if you think yours, it's so awful, why don't you write something? So I wrote a skit that went into the next review. And he said, why don't you expand it into a play? And because I didn't know I couldn't, I did. And that went on in quite a small theatre, like a 200-seater. But it ran for nearly a year. And it was one of the longest running plays in Jamaica's history. And I had absolutely no idea what I'd done. I just thought, okay, I wrote a play. The only disagreement I had was I'd given him the script and I hadn't given him a name particularly for it. I'd gone on holiday and when I come back, he had started advertising it as The Rapist, which I thought was not quite the title that I wanted. But that's what it was and that's what stuck. But yeah, that's I kind of drifted into theatre, having done a degree in archaeology and anthropology.
Wow. Do you ever read that play?
I've read it back, and what's interesting is I have an interesting relationship with my now dead sister, but we had a really interesting, quite tense relationship, and it's very much reflected in the play. And the other thing that's kind of weird is when I was at Cambridge, there was something called the Cambridge Rapist, who was this man who literally terrified campus, and we were told, don't walk singly anywhere. We were issued with whistles and all sorts of things. So the idea of a predatory rapist or somebody who could turn on you clearly had sort of sunk in at the back of my mind, and sort of everything kind of collided. So I think everything you write has autobiographical elements in it. And I, having gone back and read it, there was that kind of huge confidence. I mean, some of the things that I wrote, I thought, my goodness, go on, girl. But yeah, there was that sense of I didn't quite know what I was doing, so I did it anyway. I mean, I'd done A-level English, so I'd read lots of plays and stuff, but yeah.
How did you get to Cambridge?
Well, my parents were met there. So for them, it was a very romantic place. They had a little flat above Botolph Lane and, they secretly got married and it was all very romantic for them, just after the war. They sort of said, apply. You had to go to some odd place and do a whole another exam. So it wasn't done on the basis of your A-levels. You had to go and write a whole nother spiel. My sister had done it before me, but she hadn't got in and she'd gone off to Canada to study. I did it, and then I heard that I'd got a place, and I'd also at the same time won the Jamaica Scholarship, which meant that I could go wherever I wanted to go because they would pay for it. Because I think if I'd got into Cambridge and it was my parents that paid for it, it might have been more difficult. But the other thing was, of course, they were both staff members at the University of the West Indies. And you never want as a teenager to go to study where your parents are on the staff. So having got the place, oddly enough, the other place that I was looking at, I think, was Ibadan. But my parents had said, no, it's too far away. And this was, long distance phone calls. No, too far away, we can't. We don't want you to go that far. So I took up they offered me a place and I took it up.
So first of all, the Jamaica Scholarship must have been a very prestigious prize to win.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best result for the island. But there was another woman who, well, she was in the same class as me, who's certifiable genius, but she got one grade lower than me in one subject. So she took the Independence Prize and I took the Jamaica Scholarship. So, yeah.
And what did you study at Cambridge?
Archaeology and anthropology, which was an interesting choice. I think I went to study anthropology more than anything else. I'd wanted to do sociology, but I knew that was at the University of the West Indies, and if they offered it, I couldn't do it. So, and then once I got there, my treatment by some of the staff members was so awful that I sort of went into archaeology because I felt safer, I guess, there. Cambridge was an interesting experience.
Yes, for, a young woman, a woman of colour, arriving at Cambridge University in the 70s. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I have had an apology from the previous mistress of Girton. I mean, some of it was absolutely lovely, meeting really bright minds. And I think what happens is you meet people from all over the country who were the brightest mind in their village, town, school, whatever. And then they get to Cambridge and they're not the brightest mind anymore. So, you can form some really interesting friendships. But it was racist. There's no other way to say it. And although Girton wasn't too bad, there was a kind of benign negligence at the time if people were unhappy. I had somebody who was in a room next door to me who was clearly bipolar. By today's standards, nobody cared. I was clearly depressed. I gained, I think, probably 50 pounds in my first year and then lost about 17 the year after that. So, clearly there was distress. But the worst of it for me was the Cambridge system is you do lectures and then you do supervisions. And because I did some of those one-on-one with male lecturers, professors, those were unpleasant. I do remember sort of at 18 sitting there with this very distinguished man who had all sorts of African art all over his walls. And him saying to me, well, you're far too bright to do the curriculum. Shall we just talk about things? Okay. So he wanted to know what the swear words were in the Caribbean. And I think he fully well knew that most of the Caribbean swear words mentioned female genitalia, shall we say. And then at one point he's looking around and he says, I like black women. At which point 18-year-old me wants to leave the room. And then he looks at me and says, oh God, not like you. I mean black till they're blue. And this is the kind of rubbish you're putting up with. Another lecturer who lectured me the entire time with his shoes on the desk so he couldn't see my face. Just unpleasant.
Yeah. And you were 18 years old?
18, yeah. I turned 19 the first year, yeah.
So obviously I'm thinking that experience also served you in terms of building a certain resilience. What are the best things that you were able to gain from being at Girton College?
I know I'm not stupid. I know I'm not stupid because as soon as I got in there, I got a first for my part one. The only reason I got an upper second for my part two, as my tutor told me afterwards, is that somebody said that I couldn't be that clever. I have a photographic memory, therefore I can't be given a first. So they gave me a viva, which terrified me. And then they said, see, she was too nervous. So I got a 2-1, but I also got a college prize, which you only give to somebody with a first. There was a lot of that. But yeah, I know that I'm quite clever. I know that I can process information when I'm ready. In Jamaica, I had to hide it, I have to tell you, because coming to England to study in that sort of post-colonial period, it was not popular. So you had to be really careful. But when I came back here, it definitely opened doors. Because as soon as they can see, oh, she's a full blue for her sport, she got, college exhibitions, she went to Cambridge, yada, 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 then people who are not sure how to approach you as a person of color, say, oh, okay, well, I've got some qualifications there that mean I can begin to picture who she is.
Let's hear from children's writer Deborah Chancellor. She had a very different experience to you. She studied at Newnham College in Cambridge in the 1980s. Let's just hear how that influenced her life.
Established in 1871, Newnham was the first women's college in Cambridge and is one of the last 3 in the university and in the UK to retain this status. Perhaps this historic bastion of women's educational rights needed a little more time to work its mysterious spell on me. When I left Cambridge on graduation day 1988, I had no intention of returning to Newnham anytime soon. I was keen to get out into the big wide world. Before long, I was working in London in children's book publishing and loving every second. But after a while, Newnham reasserted its firm hold. I guess it must be impossible to spend 3 years in that feisty all-female establishment without being radicalised by its feminist credentials. Working in a big male-dominated publishing company, it dawned on me that women don't always call the shots. There were many female editors in the office, but no female directors. The Newnhamite in me balked at this depressing epiphany. I was and remain convinced that women should be confident, assertive, and therefore successful in whatever path they choose to follow. When I began to write for children, first as an editor, then as a freelance author, it seemed a betrayal of my gender not to give my writing ambitions my best effort and enthusiasm. So I worked hard, very hard. Meanwhile, I became a mother, and by the time I had my 3rd child, I was writing my 40th book. or thereabouts. I'd stopped counting by then. With delayed effect, Newnham had instilled in me a strong work ethic. To this day, I've never quite managed to shake it off.
Have you managed to shake off Girton College?
No, I think it's still with me. It's definitely still with me. I still have one or two friends. And, that's a long friendship. One from Devon, another one from Ireland. So there was that sense of coming into a world that they didn't know, just like with me. I'm aware that it continues to be, like most places with a lot of intelligent people, it maintains a real root in its traditions, some of which I don't agree with, but it also moves on. There's a lovely postgraduate student who is putting together an archive on the black women who went through Cambridge. So I'm working with her. Cambridge Council is about to put up a plaque to my mother. I have a little plaque in the sports thing at Girton. So there's a continuity, I guess, a relationship. And I had an uncle who went to Selwyn. And so it's part of a family mythology, but I'm aware of, shall we say, the underbelly of what Cambridge represents.
But it obviously shaped you creatively.
So. I think I'm not so sure about creatively. I think that had more to do with the fact that Jamaica, having become independent in 1962, was trying to find out what it meant. I mean, we used to draw Christmas cards with pine trees and snow, not poinsettias. To kind of purge a culture is a very, very active thing. And we set up a National Dance Theatre Company, and there was the National Pantomime, and there was this strong sense of trying to find dance forms and theatrical forms that belong to us. We looked to South Africa and we looked to other places. So there was a sense, I think, of the energy of everybody trying to get in there and do something, which I think is part of why, I was quite confident about, in Jamaica certainly, about moving forward. The other thing, of course, is a lot of the time that I was there, I wrote and produced a daily radio soap, which allowed me, some autonomy, because I ran it. The pressure was to write 5 episodes a week, which was a lot. But
That is a lot.
It is. I didn't realize that until I got here, and then I had to write 2 a month. But I also connected with the Jamaica School of Drama and a lot of the wonderful graduates that are coming out of there, all kinds of directors up and down the Caribbean. So I think what was happening in the Caribbean in terms of change was as important to give me the confidence to be creative. I think what Cambridge gave me was the sense that I know that intellectually I'm sound. I knew that my education, oddly, in the Caribbean was as good as most of the people who were there. And I think it also allows you to, certainly in this society, in British society, as soon as you say you went to Cambridge, there's a small switch that gets flicked.
You once said, we are all about the art, but we can't help being political. Is that still true for you?
Oh, yeah. And I think what's wonderful is that, with the recent television shows about the post office scandal, with all the things that you see being manifested in the arts. I look at just some of the rappers that are coming out of America and some of the people here, and the fact that the arts are confronting. And that's why I think conservative governments, with a small c, fear artists. Because we ask questions and we push boundaries, and I think that's absolutely necessary. Or we just say, this is what's happening. Isn't it ugly? Or isn't it beautiful? And I think that to have the courage to do that. And it does worry me a bit that funding seems to be cutting back. And I don't know if you found this, but I see so many young playwrights, particularly young women, who write that first big blurt, which is their sort of visceral story, but then don't seem to get the chance for their craft to go to the bigger stories, to go to telling other things. And they seem to be kind of slightly trapped in small casts, small theatres. Not everybody, but you do get a sense that there's a kind of very strong ceiling on creativity.
Yeah, I think we both have big pens. Mm-hmm. And it is difficult sometimes finding those platforms.
Absolutely.
To really tell those stories.
Mm.
I do believe that political theatre is really important now, as do you. Do you feel that political theatre will survive in this current climate?
I think that political theatre knows how to be subversive. And it'll become absurd, or it will become something else. But the message will always be there. It's interesting that when you tune into what people are actually saying, it's fascinating to me how anarchic the arts can be, in all of its forms. Just something simple like going to an exhibition and just seeing an absolutely beautiful rendition of a common occurrence in Black life, and to have it presented in that space in that particular way, that statement alone is subversive. So it's not necessarily about shouting. It's about the core, the essence of what the art is committed to, and then to create art with that commitment in mind.
What's your writing process like?
I haven't done much of it recently. I've been doing far too many other things. I'm a little bit scared right now. I've got to that point where I think I want to write something, but what do I write now? So I've been helping lots of other people to write. You know, there's some people who blurt and then sort of carve out the story. I tend to have the story sitting in my head for months, and it's just going around and around and around. And it's what I call embroidering. I just keep adding little bits. So by the time I write, I tend to write quite quickly and quite solidly. I mean, most of my first drafts will go through maybe 2 or 3 polishings, but I don't do that whole tearing it all apart and having to do it, because I've thought about it for so long.
So how long does the first draft take you?
3 weeks.
That's impressive.
Yeah, but that's after 9 months of wandering around looking like I'm completely crazy. I had like Chickafoot Boys, which is a story I wrote about Caribbean soldiers in World War I. I had the men in my head for so long, I couldn't find anything to tie them together. And I hated that idea of them being 3 different voices. And then I found a woman who ran a bar in which all 3 characters collided. But that took me ages.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you talk about the idea that you use autobiography, I named the character Medora because there was a woman in my life who used to work with the family, help out the family. She was a small farmer. She would babysit us, whose name was Medora, and she was the greatest hero in my life. So I constantly use her name in the things that I write. So I think politics will always be in everything, simply because if it's small p personal politics, it's big party politics, writers cannot disguise the core from which they write.
I think that brings us nicely back to our archive and to author Marina Benjamin on her own artistic flow and what it means to be in the zone.
I think every writer treasures those rare times in the process of writing a long piece of work, when you lose yourself in the writing so completely that you forget yourself. You don't hear the phone ringing and you don't feel hunger's gnaw. Unaware of your surroundings, you are deaf to the world and its intrusions, oblivious to passing time. Inoculated in this way against distraction, your mind is one-pointed, your focus honed to a needle sharpness, and your thoughts start pouring onto the page almost as if bypassing consciousness itself. At such times, concentrating is not something you do. It's more like something you are. Writers often refer to this state as being in the zone. They long to reach it because once inside it, one feels effortlessly productive, all-conquering, masterful. But it is not a biddable state of mind. If you're lucky, it will descend upon you and submerge you. But you cannot click your fingers and summon it into being. You cannot think your way into it either. Only sink into it, becoming so absorbed in the work at hand, it's as if the words you write are not being actively thought up, so much as channeled. There is a technical term for this kind of whole-body experience, and that is flow. Named in the mid-20th century by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, it describes a mental state characterized by an intense absorption, the loss of self-consciousness, and an altered perception of time. Flow experiences are deeply rewarding because they arise when our skill level is perfectly matched to the challenge we've set ourselves. Too big a challenge and we become anxious, too little and we become apathetic. But when the means is equal to the task, it gives rise to a glowing satisfaction. And the glow is literal, because when a person is inside flow, their capillaries dilate, their face flushes. Heat radiates off them in smug little waves. Csikszentmihalyi was interested in the philosophy of optimal experience and its links to happiness. But I am more interested in flow as a creative state, the way it merges action and awareness, the clarity it brings, how you are both in control of your output, which seems to spring fully formed onto the page, and yet somehow at the same time out of control, flow is a profoundly egoless experience. I wonder sometimes if the concept of flow explains those states of automaticity that characterize the inspired writings of religious mystics, when reams of spiritual work are produced in a matter of weeks or days. The cultural critic Jonathan Rowson points out that at root, flow is less a virtue than a form of pleasure. He cautions that it might not always lead to desirable qualities of character, but might just as likely yield atomized feelings of hedonism, disconnected, disorientated, and alienated, not unlike the zoned-out state of online gamers glued to their screens for hours. He may be right, but if you can get into a state of zoned-out pleasure and actually produce something worthwhile, I can't really see the problem.
There's something that Marina says, which actually reminds me of Carl Jung. He said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are.
I'm still working on it.
You're still working on it. When I kind of work towards that feeling, that's when I'm in flow.
Yeah, and it's very specific. It's almost as if everything disappears and it's literally a sort of tunnel. And one of the more, it's not the distressing experience, but, for example, audio drama is very, very deadline-led. Your broadcast date is set when you're commissioned, so you have no room. When you're almost trying to force something like that, it's a very difficult thing. But when you're actually in that point where the player's got to hear and you cannot keep it in any longer and it has to come out, and that's wonderful. But time will just pass like that. Remember ages ago when I was married, my husband, we were supposed to be going to the movies, and I said, just 10 minutes more, let me finish this up. An hour and a half later, he said, it's no point because the movie's over. So, yeah. It's a wonderful thing to achieve, but I'm really interested that she says it's where your skill matches a challenge. And I think that's an interesting idea. I also like the use of the words gnaw and smug. Thought she did. I really like those images. That's what I'm facing right now. I think what I'm deciding to do is to try a different form. See if I can write a memoir. So that's the latest challenge I've set myself, because I've had quite an unusual life. And I would quite like to put some of it down, partly because it's entertaining.
You've also written a lot for theatre and radio.
Yeah.
Which do you prefer? And would you consider your memoir as a radio piece?
I think you'd have to get past the commissioners first, and then we'd have to convince them that it was worth doing. Because, audio drama's changed an awful lot in the time since I was there. I love theatre, and I would love to feel the urgency of something I want to say in theatre. But the ideas that I've had for theatre are so huge, they're like casts of 15. And I kind of think that's probably not going to happen. So I think this is why I've kind of decided memoir. One of the privileges I have is that I'm chair of the board of Avon Foundation, which is a literary charity, and I went on one of their training courses for memoir. That made me realize how difficult and challenging it's going to be, but also that it might be something really interesting to do. So yes, I can't find at the moment a space where the plays I want to write might go. And I'm a little hesitant, being somewhat lazy, to write a whole play and I don't know where it's going. So I think if I'm going to take that chance, I'm going to try and do it with the memoir. And it may very well turn out as a set of radio monologues. I don't know. I don't know what the form will be. I know the stories I want to tell. So we'll see what happens.
What did you find challenging about learning memoir writing?
There's a discipline to writing drama, which is that you have the dialogue and you have whatever the stage instructions are. And that's basically it. You have text and subtext. You have the luxury of the visual of the stage and you have the actors. But in terms of the writing, it's very strongly disciplined. And I think when you're writing more in a prose format, you get to meander slightly more. And the challenging thing for me also is how you use language. Because you're not talking to characters anymore. How you personally use language becomes, to me, more interesting. Because again, I'm deciding, I wrote and sometimes think so much in patois. How do I put that into the work that I want without it coming across as kind of, Caribbean, merry peasant, because I don't want that. So there's a lot of different kinds of thinking that I have to do for that. Whereas the discipline of theatre, whether it's theatre for audio or just theatre for the stage, it's the tools that you're given you have to use properly, but it's very spare. So to relax into the luxury of doing more than that, but also being clean and disciplined in that. You can see I'm terrifying myself already just by talking about it. But yes, that's the challenge I'm setting myself at the moment.
So you've done a lot of theatre directing. How does that differ to directing for radio
I've done
drama?
some theatre directing. I mean, there was a piece that I did in Trinidad. I did a little in Jamaica. I've done readings here, but I've not done full scale. I always put teams together for the productions that I did at Talawa. Done a fair amount of audio directing. It's an interesting process because it's very immediate, particularly for audio. You know, you have a day, 2 days, 3 days, whatever it is, to get the thing done. And so there's a point at which casting is tremendously important. Because an actor who in 6 weeks rehearsal can give you a brilliant performance can't in an hour and a half give you a brilliant performance. So you have to create the rapport with them. And then the one thing I have learned over the years is the captain of the ship have to look like they know what they're doing. So you go out there, you're confident, you know, you say what you want to say. But I think the trick always is to listen, because the technical people, the people who have done all the production work with you and the cast, we're all on a team to try and get the best work that we possibly can. And what's been lovely about Faith, Hope and Glory is that every time I manage to bring on new actors, new directors, new talent. So hopefully when it's over, there's something has been seeded in, you know.
Our archive has a very interesting conversation between dramatists Nicola Baldwin and Amanda Whittington about the difference between theatre and radio. Let's have a listen.
Yes.
I think it probably took me a couple of goes to realise what it was. I do remember that with the first play, I liked the feeling that you could do anything, although I would argue you can go anywhere on stage just as easily. I like the feeling, I suppose I like the feeling of it being like a message in a bottle, because you really don't know who the audience is. You don't know who might be sitting in their car or at home or catch it by accident. So you're writing this story for people to discover. I think I enjoyed that without realising that's what I was enjoying.
And I think there's something about the intimacy of radio as well, isn't there? And the
Absolutely.
fact that, you know, most people are listening alone in their cars or in their home, as opposed to an audience in theatre.
Yes.
And that gives you, I think, a very different approach to your narrative in a way.
I think that's really true. And I think there are things that you often in the first draft, maybe, of a stage play, I might have quite long speeches that are like monologues, and we'll probably end up cutting those or developing them into a scene or developing them into action. But what surprised me about radio, and I didn't do it in my early plays, but then came on to do it more, is that accessing that interior world of the character is something radio does brilliantly. So things that might seem stagey as monologues, in radio, like you say, you're listening on your own, you're listening in a totally different way, and you've got that access inside.
And there's a sense of those characters really talking in your ear, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. And they don't feel like, as you say, monologues. It feels like you are inhabiting someone's mind and sharing their inner life. And that flow you can get from the internal to the external, in that you can't quite get in theatre in the same way, I think, or film, is that you're just, you know, because of there's no physical aspect to a radio play, there's no staging of a radio play.
No.
You can move in a very fluid way between those states. And I think sometimes just the kind of the constraints of radio in terms of it being 15-minute slots or 45-minute slots. And one way you're writing very specifically to the minute, aren't you?
Yes.
But in another way, it's a completely different approach to dramatising stories when you have relatively small amounts of time in order to sort of pack in your narrative and your character. And I know I found writing for radio, those 15-minute dramas are really kind of liberating in a way that you don't have to structure this 2-hour arc, you know, and you can do it in these bite-sized pieces.
I think it's a surprisingly hard thing to learn. I think you do it fantastically, to be able to sculpt time in that way. I think that's what you learn from radio. It's not just about stage space. It's not about the kind of shared audience space you get in theatre. Absolute making time plastic and using it like that.
Making time plastic. That's an interesting way of phrasing it. It is a very specific discipline. And oddly enough, if you know a basic 3-act structure or basic 5-act structure, that's what you're doing in miniature in a 50-minute episode. But you have to have your, the hook at the end, or your cliffhanger if it's a, if it's one of the 5 episodes of the week, cliffhanger, and then hook for the weekend to go into the next week.
So it's a bit more like TV drama in some ways.
There's definite craft on the 15-minute ones. There's it's interesting. It is quite intimate. That sense that you're right there. Somebody's listening to you. Essentially, usually on your own. It's not often a mass activity, is it? It's a very specific form, but sculpting time. I'm still trying to think about that. It's definitely a discipline, and it's all the usual things. You set up a question, you play around with that question, you give something of an answer, and that's essentially what drama is about. And what do they say? You come for the story and you stay for the relationships. So all of those things are useful to remember. I quite like radio.
Pat, you've adapted some great work
I have.
by novelists of Toni Morrison, Andrea Levy, Zora Neale Hurston, Maya Angelou.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite at all?
I'd always wanted to do Beloved. Mainly because when I first read it, it had been like an absolute shock to my soul. Because every writing thing that we'd, about writing for a medium other than, sort of literary fiction, was you have to have a white protagonist. You have to have a way to get audiences into the story. And here was this thing just barreling at you, and there was not a concern, a description, anything. There was just this life that she was talking about. And it broke your heart and it made you laugh, and it was just wonderful. And tried for ages. It was one of the first things I said, and I think it took nearly 15 years before they got the permission for Beloved. And when we got Beloved, we had the most amazing cast of actors, just all kinds of people. We had music used in a very particular way. There was just something about that whole process of recording and the cast and everything else. It was just, to me, completely magical. And it breaks your heart to go into the stories that she tells. You're literally typing away and crying, But it's also that it's the other part of your brain, which is that kind of quite ruthless, surgical part of your brain that says, okay, these next 2 pages don't matter, let's go. To do that to somebody who is like Toni Morrison or Maya Angelou, I literally had to kind of forget who was writing the work and just say, okay, this is what my task is, and sort of get on with it. So it's an editing one, and then it's also the just absolute joy of seeing these actors just lift it up and make it wonderful.
In terms of artistic leadership in this country, what do you think is required at the moment, given the challenges that particularly the theatre industry is facing?
I don't know that much about it. I think it's courage. I look at somebody like Lynette Linton and Daniel and the work that they're doing at the Bush, which is making marvellous theatre in smaller spaces, and how that's moved outwards. And I think that to me is very, very hopeful. But theatre has always been, in all my time that I've been here, a process of getting past gatekeepers. And gatekeepers have very specific things about what audiences they want, what incomes they need to earn, and all of that kind of stuff. But also that they're guardians of what they see as a particular literary and theatrical tradition. And you have to make the arguments that what we're doing is enriching and, adding spice, or whatever phrase you want to use. We are not destroying, we are essentially enriching, But that's a hard argument to make, especially when you're making it around money. And as the money has got less, as I said, I have a concern that so many pieces are one person or 3 persons, and they rotate around fairly similar subjects. This is seen as a black play. And the thing that gives me a lot of hope, though, is, I think the right word for it is Afrofuturism. The idea that you've freed yourself from those narratives and actually you're creating a future for yourself. I have to tell you that I'm a sentimental person, and I went to Black Panther 4 or 5 times. Because
it's a great film.
It is, but it was the first time in my life, and I'm an ageable person, walking out of it, that I understood how people could walk out of other movies and feel affirmed by it. They saw people like themselves. They saw experiences like they had, places that they lived. I hadn't seen that. Like, you could kind of bounce out of Black Panther going, yeah, Vibranium and Wakanda, come for me. It's that kind of the strength of the mythology of it and the fact that it was woven into a whole other universe. And you see that, South Asian and Filipino and North African and South African elements and of design and all of that kind of stuff. And then you hear Trevor Noah's voice being a robot. And you've got Letitia playing Shuri, who's just a kid from London who's just being amazing. So, yeah, the power of it is incredible. I don't know how often, whether there are routes to get to that kind of expression still, without an awful lot of support, an awful lot of creating pathways and then bringing other people behind. And hopefully everybody breaks slightly more. But I do think there are two things happening. I think for me, the West is kind of hardening around a concept of what it means to be cultural. And I think there's also a growing sense of the rest of the world thinking, actually, we can talk to one another.
I love the way that you leaned into Afrofuturism, because I think it is something that is gathering pace. And I know that producers are really looking for this kind of work. This brings us very nicely to the writer Morgan Witzel, who talks about the future of literature, actually. He's in our archive. Let's give him a listen.
I read in The Guardian that Bret Easton Ellis, giant of the American literary scene, has been castigating millennials for not, he says, being interested in reading books. Millennials no longer read, he says. They spend their time on social media or binge on Netflix and Amazon Prime. What Bret Easton Ellis is really decrying is not the decline of reading generally, but the decline of the literary novel. In particular, the daring, risky fiction of authors like Ellis himself, Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, Salman Rushdie, and others who dominated the Booker Prize shortlists in the 1980s and 1990s. Ellis asserts that it is harder to get such books published today because there is no demand for them, and therefore publishers will not commit to publish them. Allow me to differ. Another article, this time from The Observer, discusses the rise of audiobooks, not just modern genre fiction, but classics such as Dickens and Tolstoy. Millennials are consuming literature, but they are doing so in different ways. Sales of ebooks have hit a plateau, but audiobooks are becoming ever more popular as people listen while undertaking other activities such as driving or exercising, rather than simply sitting down and reading. And look, too, at the boom in young adult fiction, where demand is rising steadily as a new generation of readers engages with books. To me, this is a sign of real hope. As a young reader myself, young adult fiction was my gateway drug before I went to university and began to mainline Milan Kundera and Graham Greene. Many of this generation may well follow the same route. Literature could usefully learn from what is going on right now in classical music. For long seen as the staid province of boring middle-aged people listening to the same pieces of music, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner, over and over again, classical music is now exploding with youth. Dynamic young performers like Sheku Kane-Mason and Jess Gillum are working with dynamic young conductors like Murga Grazanita Tila at Birmingham. New composers are springing up all around the world. There has never been a better time for new classical music. Why? Because these young performers and composers and conductors no longer think about classical music. They simply see music as music. The young artists who joined Jess Gillum on her BBC Radio 3 show, This Classical Life, mix classical and jazz, funk and spectral, Beethoven and Beyoncé, Hildegard of Bingen and David Bowie, all of which I have heard on the program. Literature needs to do the same, breaking down some of the walls around itself, becoming less self-referential, and indeed less self-revering. The appearance of crime novels on the Booker shortlist is a welcome step in the right direction. Literature will survive, but first it has to connect with the people who are there to read it. My advice to Bret Easton Ellis would be, find out what people are reading and then write for them. The demand for daring, risky literature is greater than ever. We just need to find out how to connect with our new and hungry audiences.
What do you make of that?
I think he's absolutely right. My favourite quote forever is Ben Ockery, we're half human, half stories. People need stories. I look at my little grandson, he's not going to read. I used to read to him. I was so desperate for him to, but he ingests stories. He's always, and whether it's a teeny tiny TikTok or it's a Wakanda or whatever it is. He ingests stories. And I think that's the thing that I have great sort of confidence in. And then I look at my son's generation, and he's constantly listening to something. So whether it's, it's podcasts or it's an audiobook and that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's not fiction, sometimes it's DIY, whatever it is. So I think people ingest stories all the time. They ingest information all the time. And I think he's absolutely right. We need to find a way to connect. But I think it's really interesting that he talks about film and other things as if that's not writing. It started with a script.
Yes.
It's always writing. Even the back of a cereal box is writing. So I think that's interesting idea that somehow literary fiction is writing. I don't know what the rest of us do, but all of it starts with the word on the page. It's a tremendously powerful thing.
Do you think the skill of reading, though, is decreasing?
Yeah. I do think there's a tendency for attention spans to be shorter. I say this because it's happened to me. I think COVID particularly, we spent quite a lot of time just, finding faff to read and to look at and to ingest. And I do think that is something that needs to be taken into account. But then you get ridiculous long-form podcasts that goes for hours and hours and hours. You've got series that people binge on for in a night. As you say, you're going to work and you haven't slept. So the power of a story is still there. The power of words is still there.
I agree with you. I must admit that I am really trying very hard to read more. I do listen to a lot of Audible and podcasts, and I love what Stephen King says, if you don't read, you can't write. I'm always trying to manage those skills and find joy from the kind of like written word on the page.
Can I ask you a question, though? I found that having been around this industry for quite a long time, my critical muscles are quite well developed. There is a point at which I'm not going to waste time doing certain things. Does that happen to you as well?
Oh, my goodness. Hey.
And I've finally given myself permission to go, okay, you don't have... But I'll read something like Love After Love, Ingrid Persaud's book.
Right.
And I will literally sit there hour after hour in tears at what happened to the characters, sitting there. And don't finish. So I've given myself permission to go, okay, this is interesting, but this is not me.
What's your creative North Star now? What guides you?
I think the thing that's always guided me, there's a little niggle of anger that says, no, this is not good enough. I want the world to be better. Right now, I think one of the things that I'm trying to struggle with as I figure out what it is I'm going to write, I've got very, very tired of the Black experience being narrowcast into its suffering, its slavery, and then after that, it's, hip-hop and drill, and, that's all that we are. Yeah. And you think, no, actually no. And I'm going to tell you other stories that take other space and don't apologize for anything and don't try to manipulate you into feeling anything along those lines. So those are the two things. It's like I want the world to be better, and I want to tell stories that kind of subvert the kind of widely held narrative. I mean, it's a simple thing like everything is about the Windrush generation. My grandfather was traveling here as a little black man to follow the West Indies cricket team in the 1930s. He would take time on the ship. He'd come over, he'd follow the cricket team around. He had certain landladies that he could stay with. So when his daughter came here to go to Cambridge, it wasn't a surprise.
Yeah, these are the stories we don't hear.
Exactly. My mother has a cousin who developed a whole breed of cattle called Jamaica Hope, which is part Brahmin, part Jersey, which gives good milk and good meat and can survive in the tropics. He gets an MBE for that. The Queen gives him an honour for all of that. And he's a little guy who lives in Jamaica and breeds cattle.
That's amazing.
So that's been going on. That interrelationship has been going on for an awfully long time. And I think simplifying it in the way that we does nobody any credit. And the other thing that really, really interests me right now is how Black British identity is being changed and given all sorts of different energies by the sort of arrival of so many West Africans, and how that sense of they're coming from middle-class backgrounds, they're coming from all kinds of backgrounds, and they're bringing a different energy to what it is. to the music, to the theatre, to everything else. And I think that's really fascinating. I think we've got over the bit where we don't like each other. I think we're actually now sort of have a sense of a common identity, and that is empowering. Yeah. And also really a really interesting thing, that's happening culturally.
You spoke about a relative of yours who got an MBE. What did it mean for you getting an MBE, for your contribution towards theatre?
Oh, that. That was really interesting because I had that huge dilemma. Do I take it because it says Empire? Do I not? Part of my thinking is I'm completely a child of Empire. I have a little bit of Indian ancestry. I have a fair amount of West African ancestry. I have Viking, Welsh, English, as well. And my sense of the world through the Commonwealth and everything else was very much that. So I didn't quite have the hostility to Empire at that point. It was also, I just left Talawa. And I was thinking, how on my own, where do I find a place? How do I give my voice some resonance? And having an MBE would be one of those things. And the last thought was, my mom would love this. She's not around, but it's kind of like, there you go, Mom. I know I did theatre, but it's okay. So I think it was all of those things. But I haven't, it's a difficult thing to do because so many people have rejected it quite naturally. And I have thought about it a lot. I think I can't even find the award. I don't know exactly where it is. But it's an interesting thing because you have to think about it quite hard. Yeah, but I did decide to take it.
As you know, one of my favourite quotes is by Albert Camus. And he says, the purpose of a writer is to stop civilization from destroying itself. Do you think he's right?
That's a hell of a responsibility. But then he's an existentialist, isn't he? So it is much more the activity than the end that he's invested in. And I think absolutely the activity of writing as a way of both documenting where we are, of creating a better future, of re-examining the past, I think absolutely is a duty that we have. I wish I could feel slightly more empowered. But then, of course, as I say, writers are the ones that create the television shows and the films and the music and all of those other things that actually do create.
Yeah, storytelling is about our humanity.
Yeah. And there you can tell your stories in lots of wonderful ways. So, on an optimistic day, I'd say that's a really good idea. I think Toni Morrison said it as well. The equivalent of when the going gets tough, writers get going, or artists get going. And I kind of believe in that as well. And it relieves you from the awful pressure of, in this society, you're judged by how much money you have. Well, if what you're saying is your value is something else, it actually relieves you from a lot of that pressure of, okay, I don't have the shiny house and this kind of car, but I'm an artist. And I'm fighting for something good. So it can be a point of pride, I think.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.